CEO Bryony Cassidy took only a few seconds to assess the man standing by the dilapidated pickup truck outside the company building. His sawdust-stained clothes, faded boots, and 20-year-old Ford made her believe he was just an ordinary delivery man. In front of international partners, she coldly asked him to leave the VIP area. But what Bryony didn't know was that the man wasn't there to deliver anything. He was the man who had co-founded Cassidy Mercer from a small garage 15 years ago. And in just a few hours, the entire corporation would witness a truth that would change everything. If you enjoy stories of humility, integrity, and emotional turnarounds, hit like, subscribe, and stay until the end of the video. What happens next will keep you glued to the screen. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Mercer Woodworks, painting long golden lines across the cedar floor. The shop sat quietly on a side street in southeast Portland, surrounded by old brick buildings and maple trees that rustled softly in the breeze. Inside, the familiar scent of oak, walnut, and varnish filled the air. Auden Mercer backed his aging green Ford pickup into its usual spot behind the workshop. The truck had carried lumber, tools, and finished furniture across Oregon for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't impressive, but it had never failed him. He unloaded the last walnut cabinet from the bed and carried it inside. Every movement was calm and practiced. The workbench stood exactly where it always had. The rows of chisels were arranged with the precision of a man who respected craftsmanship more than appearances. Near the window, 9-year-old Wren sat on a folding stool, carefully drawing patterns onto a small birch box she had spent the week sanding. She glanced up as he entered. "You were gone longer today." Auden smiled faintly. "Traffic." Wren nodded and returned to her drawing. She rarely pushed for answers. She had inherited her mother's patience and her father's quiet nature. For a while, neither of them spoke. The workshop felt peaceful, safe. It was the kind of silence Auden had spent years building after losing so much. He hung his jacket on the wall beside an old work shirt. The faded shirt carried a worn circular patch on the shoulder, almost invisible now. The embroidery had faded until it looked more like a memory than a logo. Wren pointed at it. "What's that patch from?" "An old job." "Was it important?" Auden paused. "A long time ago." That answer seemed enough. The phone rang. The sound felt unusually loud inside the quiet shop. Auden glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number, yet somehow, he knew exactly who was calling before he answered. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a familiar voice. Older, tired, but unmistakable. "I need you." Auden froze. The years between them suddenly felt much shorter. The voice continued. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. The old building." Auden looked toward Wren. She was focused on her drawing, completely unaware that a single phone call had just reopened a chapter of his life he believed was finished forever. He answered quietly. "I'll be there." The call ended. No explanation. No details. None were necessary. Auden stood motionless for several seconds. Tomorrow, he would walk back into a place he hadn't entered in 8 years. A place that still carried his name. "Dad?" He looked down. Wren was watching him. "Where are you going tomorrow?" He sat beside her on the floor. "To see an old friend." "Someone important?" "Yes." She smiled. "Then I hope it goes well." Auden felt a small ache in his chest. Wren always knew exactly what to say. As the afternoon faded into evening, the sunlight turned orange. The shadows inside the workshop stretched longer. After dinner, Wren went upstairs to bed. Auden waited until he heard the steady rhythm of her breathing before returning to the workshop alone. The overhead lights remained off. Only the workbench lamp illuminated the room. He opened a lower drawer and removed a weathered leather envelope. Inside was a photograph. Soma Turusin Oiliu. A small garage in Tigard. Auden was 25 years old. Standing beside him was Hollis Cassidy. Neither man looked wealthy. Neither looked powerful. They looked exhausted, hopeful, determined. Behind them stood a rough workbench assembled from scrap lumber and borrowed tools. It had been the first headquarters of a company that didn't officially exist yet. On the back of the photograph were 3 words written in Helena's careful handwriting. Day 1, 2011. Auden stared at those words. Memories surfaced immediately. Long nights, impossible deadlines, prototype failures, small victories, the excitement of building something from nothing. Then another memory appeared. A kitchen. Spring of 2016. Helena standing beside the table holding a folder from the neurologist. The diagnosis had changed everything. The future they imagined suddenly became uncertain. Auden remembered the fear, the helplessness, the feeling that every plan they had made was slipping away. Yet Helena had remained calm. She had placed her hand over his and spoken with the same strength she carried until the very end. Don't stay because you're afraid. He remembered looking at her in confusion. She smiled. Stay if you want to stay. But if leaving gives our family a better future, then leave. She wasn't thinking about herself. She never had. Even while facing her own illness, she worried about him, about the child they would soon bring into the world, about the future they might never see together. That conversation changed everything. Over the next 2 years, Auden gradually stepped away from the company he had helped build. He sold back shares, gave up leadership responsibilities, walked away from the spotlight, and devoted himself entirely to Helena and Wren. He never regretted it. Not once. The workshop grew quiet again. Auden carefully returned the photograph to the envelope. Then he removed the old work shirt from the wall. His fingers brushed the faded patch. The logo was almost impossible to read now. Almost. He knew every thread by memory. For years, he had avoided looking backward. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would return, not as an executive, not as a founder, not as a man seeking recognition. He would return because an old friend had asked for help. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. Auden walked out to the driveway. The green Ford sat beneath the evening sky exactly where it always had. He rested a hand on the hood. The metal still held the warmth of the afternoon sun. For a long moment, he stood there alone, thinking about the years behind him, thinking about the responsibilities waiting ahead, and wondering whether the company he helped create was still the company he remembered. Tomorrow, he would find out. Wednesday morning, the Portland sky was unusually clear. At precisely 8:50 a.m., the main lobby of the Cassidy Mercer Tower was bustling, as usual. Senior staff hurried between elevators, while the Japanese delegation was being personally received by CEO Bryony Cassidy. Bryony had just finished her introduction of the company's history when the main door opened. A man walked in. An old flannel shirt, faded work boots, no briefcase, no bodyguard. There was no sign that he belonged to one of the largest medical equipment corporations in the Pacific Northwest. Bryony recognized him instantly. It was the man with the old pickup truck she had seen the day before. She hurried toward him. Sir, I told you yesterday that the delivery area is behind the building. His voice was professional, but loud enough for everyone around to hear. And today is no different. The man didn't reply. He simply continued walking toward the security desk. At that moment, Matthias Doyle, the building's head of security for 18 years, immediately stood up. He left the reception desk and approached the man. Then, to the astonishment of everyone in the lobby, Matthias bowed slightly. Welcome back, Mr. Mercer. The voice echoed clearly in the quiet space. The chairman is waiting for you upstairs. Bryony froze. Mercer? She turned her head to look up at the wall behind the reception desk. The familiar, large lettering appeared before her eyes. Cassidy, Mercer, the name she had seen every day for years, but had never really thought about it. Just then, the private elevator opened. Hollis Cassidy stepped out, chairman of the board, Bryony's father. He walked straight towards the man in the flannel shirt without hesitation. Then, in front of the entire Japanese delegation, the board members, and dozens of employees present in the hall, Hollis embraced him warmly. You've arrived. Auden nodded slightly. You called me. Hollis smiled and turned to the guests. Please excuse me. He spoke in a formal tone. I would like to introduce someone special. He placed his hand on Auden's shoulder. This is Auden Mercer, the man who founded this company with me in a small garage in Tigard 15 years ago. The hall fell almost completely silent. An engineer in the Japanese delegation immediately recognized the name. He bowed respectfully. Dr. Mercer. I cited your sensor patent in my research paper. Auden returned a polite bow. No exaggeration, no pride, no further explanation. Bryony stood motionless. For the first time in years of running the company, she felt like the least knowledgeable person in the room. A few minutes later, as the private elevator doors closed behind Hollis and Auden, Bryony still stared at the inscription on the wall. Cassidy, Mercer. Suddenly she realized that the man she had mistaken for a delivery driver yesterday was actually one of the two people who had built the entire empire she was running today. Hollis Cassidy's office on the 42nd floor remains virtually unchanged after many years. The old bookshelves, dark wooden desk, and glass windows overlooking the city of Portland make the room feel more like a place of history than the power center of a billion-dollar corporation. The door closed. Only 3 people left: Hollis Cassidy, Bryony Cassidy, and Auden Mercer. Bryony sat upright on the left side of her father's desk. Auden sat opposite. No one said anything for the first few seconds. Finally, Hollis broke the silence. Auden and his father founded this company in 2011. He looked straight at his daughter, in a rented garage in Tigard. Bryony listened silently. At that time, my father had experience in the medical equipment industry. Auden was a talented engineer with ideas that no one dared to invest in. Hollis smiled slightly. We build everything from scratch. He paused for a few seconds before continuing. In 2016, Auden's wife was diagnosed with a serious neurological disease. The air in the room slackened. Auden spent the next 2 years withdrawing from the company and taking care of his family. Bryony turned to look at Auden for the first time since entering the room. The man remained calm. No excuses. Don't look for sympathy. Simply listen. So why didn't you know about this before? Bryony asked. Because that was Auden's wish, Hollis replied. And because I believe you don't need to know the entire history to run the company well. After a few seconds of thinking, Bryony nodded. Then Hollis pushed a file toward Auden. Now comes the reason why I called you back. Auden opened the file. Inside are a series of technical reports from partner hospitals. Pressure sensors used in medical equipment have been showing unusual errors for months. The quality control department concluded that the deviations were still within acceptable limits. But Hollis didn't believe it. Auden read each page very quickly. Just about a minute later, he put down the file. Who signed off on the third quarter component supplier change? Bryony immediately opened the data on the tablet. A name appeared. Pruitt. The atmosphere in the room immediately changed. Auden said nothing more. He just tapped his fingers lightly on the table. It's like an engineer just discovered a detail that others had overlooked. Finally, he raised his head. I need a private lab. 3 days. No internal notification. Bryony did not hesitate. She took off the high-level access card she was wearing around her neck and placed it in front of him. From now on, you have full authority to use all necessary resources. The 2 people's fingers touched lightly when the card was given. The moment only lasted a second, but enough for both of them to realize that the story between them has not really begun yet. Somewhere inside Cassidy Mercer, a much bigger secret is waiting to be exposed. The laboratory on the 14th floor was almost exactly as it had been 8 years ago. The familiar rows of workstations, sensor testing equipment, and fluorescent lights made Auden feel as if time had never passed. As soon as he entered, Eleanor Vosberg looked up from her workbench. She rose immediately. No greeting, no question, just a tight hug. Auden Smil. He was the one who had hired Eleanor in 2014. 2 other technicians in the room also approached to shake his hand with obvious respect. But at the end of the hallway, Marin Holloway, head of quality control, simply watched. She didn't approach. For the past 8 months, she had silently suspected something was amiss in the company. And now, for the first time, she felt that perhaps the right person had appeared to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, on the 40th floor, a completely different encounter was taking place. Wren Mercer arrived at the building for her usual appointment with Hollis Cassidy. For the past 2 years, she had visited the elderly chairman every Wednesday. Hollis always called her his honorary granddaughter. As Bryony stepped out into the waiting area, she found Wren sitting by the window, intently drawing on a small wooden box. The girl looked up and smiled. "You work on the top floor, don't you?" Bryony was surprised by the question. "Yes. Mr. Hollis said you're very good at your job." For the first time in days, Bryony didn't know how to respond. She sat down in the chair next to her. "What are you drawing?" "A gift box," Wren answered simply. Then, unexpectedly, he asked again, "How is your mother?" The question made Bryony pause. She looked out the window for a few seconds before answering. "My mother passed away a long time ago." Wren nodded slightly. "Mean it too." The atmosphere between them changed instantly. There was no longer any distance between a CEO and a child. Only two people sharing a common loss. They began choosing colors for their painting together. 2 different shades of blue were mixed in the small box. Neither said much, but the silence was strangely comforting. Early in the afternoon, Auden went upstairs to pick up his daughter. As he reached the end of the hallway, he was surprised to see Bryony sitting next to Wren. The two were intently completing their painting, like old friends. Auden paused for a few seconds, silently observing. Saying nothing, Wren saw her father first. "Dad!" She happily ran towards him. Bryony stood up. For the first time since they reunited, she didn't look at Auden with the judgmental gaze of a CEO judging others by their appearance. She simply nodded, a small gesture, but enough to signal that something between them was beginning to change. Thursday night, the lights were off on most floors in Cassidy Mercer Tower, but the laboratory on the 14th floor was still lit. Auden Mercer is sitting alone at his desk, reviewing the designs of the 2nd generation of pressure sensors, the product that helped the company rise to become one of the region's leading medical device manufacturers. At that moment, the laboratory door opened. Maren Holloway enters. She closed the door behind her and went straight to Auden's desk. No greetings, no beating around the bush. She placed a black USB on the table. For a few seconds, her hand remained on it, as if pondering something. Finally, she pushed it toward Auden. "I've been collecting these for 8 months. Her voice was calm but heavy. Auden was in no hurry to pick up the USB. He waited for her to continue. "Invoice for purchasing components. Batch code. The quality inspection report has been edited. Email requesting data change. And records of 2 engineers who tried to report the problem and were fired." Maren stopped. "I didn't show it to anyone before, because I wasn't sure anyone in the company had enough power to fight them." Her eyes looked straight at Auden. "Until you come back." The room became quiet. "Auden holds the USB." "Thank you, Maren." She nodded slightly. Before leaving, Maren stopped at the door. "You may not remember, but it was you who signed and approved my recruitment application in 2014. Having finished speaking, she walked out. Auden plugged the USB into a standalone computer in the corner of the room. Each document appears on the screen. 10 minutes, then 15 minutes. After nearly 20 minutes of continuous reading, he picked up the phone. The person he called was Bryony Cassidy. Half an hour later, Bryony appeared at the lab. No business suits, no high heels, just a simple sweater and jeans. For the first time since Auden returned to the company, she looked more like someone trying to find the truth than a CEO running a corporation. 2 people sit next to each other in front of the screen. Each document is opened. Each invoice is compared. Each email is checked. The more you read, the clearer the truth becomes. Pruitt Vance secretly transferred the sensor supply contract to a manufacturer that did not meet the required medical certification. Production costs decreased sharply, but the quality of components also decreased. The $1 million difference was routed through multiple intermediaries before returning to an account linked to Pruitt. Bryony kept taking notes. Auden constantly collated technical data. They worked until almost midnight. Finally, the whole picture appears. Not a mistake. It's not a mistake. It's intentional fraud. The total amount involved exceeds $4 million. What's even scarier is that those components have been installed into respiratory support devices for children at many partner hospitals. While checking the files, Bryony suddenly spoke up. When did Wren's mother die? Auden did not raise his head. 5 years ago. Bryony was silent for a few seconds. Wren was only 4 years old at the time. That's right. No one said anything more. But the silence this time was no longer as tense as before. It has a different feel, understanding. As the clock neared midnight, Bryony closed the last file. She looked towards Auden. For the first time since meeting him, she understood that the man sitting in front of her was more than just a forgotten founder. He is also the only person experienced enough, honest enough, and courageous enough to bring the truth to light. And from that moment, the real war began. On Friday morning, the atmosphere inside Cassidy Mercer Tower had changed. Outwardly, everything seemed to be running as usual. Employees moved between floors. Meetings proceeded as scheduled. Phones still rang. But in the most important parts of the building, a storm was brewing. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, Pruitt Vance called Marin Holloway into his private office. He closed the door behind him. That was unlike his usual routine. Pruitt stood by the window, looking down at Portland below. He turned around. "You spoke with Mercer." "That wasn't a question." Marin calmly replied. "I've waited 8 months to speak with the right person." Pruitt looked at her intently. His gaze no longer held its usual confidence. "Do you know what you're doing?" "I know perfectly well," Marin replied. "I'm doing what should have been done a long time ago." No one said anything more. She turned and walked out of the office. For the first time in years, Pruitt felt he was losing control. All afternoon, he made a string of phone calls. 8 calls. 8 attempts to salvage the situation, but none of them yielded the results he desired. Those who had once stood by him began to distance themselves. Those who had remained silent now didn't want to be involved. Rumors had begun to spread within the company. At 4:15, Pruitt decided to act on his own. He went down to the underground parking garage, hidden behind a concrete pillar near the exit, waiting. A few minutes later, Auden Mercer appeared. He walked toward his old Ford pickup truck as usual. Pruitt got out. "You left this company 10 years ago." His voice was cold. "You no longer have the right to interfere in anything here." Auden stopped by the car door. He looked at Pruitt, but showed no anger. "I'm not here for power," he replied calmly. "I'm here because of a debt. A debt to someone who trusted me 15 years ago." Pruitt frowned, but Auden continued. "You've misunderstood what's happening. No explanation, no argument." He opened the car door, started the engine. The old Ford started on its first try. Then it slowly drove out of the parking lot. Pruitt stood still, watching. For the first time since Auden's appearance in the company lobby on Wednesday, he truly understood that he was in danger. Meanwhile, on the 43rd floor, Bryony Cassidy had begun her next move. She convened an emergency board meeting on Monday morning. All the evidence was reorganized. Legal documents were reviewed. Every procedure was meticulously prepared to ensure there were no loopholes. Late in the afternoon, Matthias Doyle requested a few minutes with the CEO. The head of security rarely made such a request. He sat down in front of Bryony. "I know someone in Vancouver," he said. "Someone who has been trying to tell the truth for months." Bryony listened intently. "He won't be coming to the company, but if I bring him to the council meeting on Monday, he'll show up." Bryony looked at Matthias for a few seconds, then nodded. "Bring him." At that very moment, all the pieces were finally in place, and by Monday morning, the truth could no longer be concealed. Saturday morning arrived in Portland with a clear blue sky and gentle early autumn sunshine. The maple trees along the roadside were still green, but the first yellow leaves were beginning to appear. At 9 o'clock, Bryony Cassidy drove her Subaru Outback to Mercer Woodworks. No driver, No assistant. No busy schedule as usual. Just her and a briefcase on the passenger seat. When the car stopped in front of the lumber mill, Wren was sitting on the steps with her familiar birchwood box. She saw Bryony first. "Good morning." Bryony smiled involuntarily. "Good morning, Wren." Auden emerged from the mill. He was still wearing his work apron and worn boots, as always. No one mentioned his title. No one mentioned the company. They simply opened the door and invited her in. Inside, Maren Holloway was connected to the online meeting from her home. The laptop on her desk illuminated her tired face. Clearly, she hadn't slept much these past few days either. The three quickly began working. Reports, invoices, emails. Each piece of evidence was rearranged in the correct order to be presented to the board. No one wanted any mistakes, because even one detail overlooked could ruin the entire plan. Wren understood this in her own childlike way. She didn't bother anyone. She spent most of her time sitting on the porch, continuing to draw on her wooden box. Occasionally, she would look inside before continuing her work. Around 10:30, Bryony got up to get coffee. Auden had prepared a pot of hot coffee and placed it beside the wood planing table. It wasn't the expensive coffee served in the corporation's meeting rooms, but when Bryony took a sip, she realized she liked the taste much more. It was authentic, just like this place. Nearly 11 o'clock, Wren entered the workshop. In her hands was a cup of hot tea. She carefully placed it down in front of Bryony, just like how she used to see her father entertain guests. "Here you go." Bryony looked at her in surprise. "Thank you." Wren just smiled and opened the wooden box she was finishing. On the lid were 3 figures drawn with colored pencils. A tall man in a gray coat, a little girl holding a pencil, and the third figure was still uncolored. Wren looked up and asked, "What color do you want for this person?" Bryony looked at the drawing for a few seconds. She didn't look at Auden. He didn't lift his head from the files he was reading either. Finally, she answered, "Light blue, like the sky at dawn." Wren nodded in satisfaction. "That's a good idea." She carried the box back to the steps and continued coloring. Inside the workshop, work continued. By almost noon, all the documents were finally finished. Maren logged out of the online meeting. Bryony packed up her computer. Tiredness was evident on everyone's faces, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief. They had prepared everything they needed. As she reached the door, Bryony paused. The document bag was on her shoulder. The car keys were in her hand. Auden was still checking the notes on his desk one last time. After a few seconds of hesitation, she walked closer, then gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Just 2 seconds, no more. A simple gesture, yet it contained more than any apology she had ever prepared. Auden didn't turn. He only nodded slightly, as he always did. Bryony smiled faintly, then got into the car. As the Subaru disappeared down the small street, they both understood that the board meeting on Monday morning wouldn't just decide Pruitt Vance's fate, it would also decide Cassidy Mercer's future, and perhaps open a whole new chapter for the people who had inadvertently entered each other's lives. Monday morning, precisely 10 o'clock, the boardroom on the 43rd floor of Cassidy Mercer Tower was packed. 9 board members were present. Hollis Cassidy sat in the chairman's seat. Bryony Cassidy sat to his left. Pruitt Vance appeared with his usual confident bearing, his silver tie perfectly tied as always. At the far end of the room, Auden Mercer sat quietly in the observer's chair. No nameplate, no title, but his presence was undeniable. The meeting began. Bryony stood up to present. For the next 7 minutes, she presented the entire body of evidence she had prepared over several days. Reports of faulty sensors, batches of substandard components, suspicious invoices, payments made through intermediary companies. And children's hospitals have been affected by equipment using substandard components. When the presentation ended, the room fell silent. Pruitt leaned back in his chair. He maintained his calm smile. "I believe this is just a problem in the procurement process," he said. "Such mistakes can still happen." Then his gaze shifted to Auden, and the man at the back of the room. "I don't understand what his presence has to do with this meeting." At that moment, Hollis Cassidy stood up. He didn't need to raise his voice. "He's here because I called him back." Hollis looked directly at the entire council. And because the M in Cassidy, Mercer isn't just a decoration on this company's wall. No one spoke. The conference room door opened. Marin Holloway entered. Following her was Matthias Doyle, and a middle-aged man from Vancouver. The man placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a notarized statement. Marin began to present each email, each document, each piece of evidence she had secretly kept for 8 months. Then, a witness from Vancouver confirmed that Pruitt Vance had directly supervised the shipment of substandard components into the production line on multiple occasions. Every timeline perfectly matched the investigation data. The truth was undeniable. At 11:34 a.m., the board of directors proceeded to vote. The results were announced immediately. 7 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, no votes against. Pruitt Vance was terminated from his position as COO. All related stock rights were suspended, and his case was transferred to federal investigators. Pruitt stood up. He gathered his documents. For the first time, the confidence on his face completely vanished. As he reached the door, he turned back to look at Auden. Auden remained seated. A calm voice rang out. "You had the opportunity to be an excellent COO." He paused. "But you chose a different path." The door closed, and with it, the darkest chapter in Cassidy Mercer history officially came to an end. 3 weeks had passed since the board meeting. Autumn had truly arrived in Portland. The maple trees along Hawthorne Avenue were beginning to turn a golden orange. Mornings were getting colder, and the Willamette River reflected the pale sunlight of early October. Inside Cassidy Mercer, things were changing too. Matthias Doyle was honored in a small ceremony in the main hall of the building after 18 years of service. Marin Holloway was appointed Vice President of Quality Control. A completely new position was also approved by the board. Director of Engineering Ethics, a title that had never existed before. That title would have the power to veto any decision regarding medical components if any risk to patients was detected, and the only person nominated for that position was Auden Mercer. Meanwhile, Pruitt Vance was formally indicted on multiple federal charges related to fraud and falsification of records. The name that once struck fear into many had now almost vanished from the company. But the biggest change wasn't in the financial reports or the governance structure. It was in a small lumber mill southeast of Portland. One Saturday morning in early October, Bryony Cassidy drove her familiar Subaru to Mercer Woodworks. This time she carried a sealed envelope. Inside was the official contract for Auden, a symbolic salary of $1 per year, no office work required, no management involvement required, only one duty: to protect the values he had established from day one. Auden read the contract and carefully folded it. He said nothing. Immediately, he got up to make tea. Just then, Wren emerged from behind with a finished birchwood box. On the lid were 3 figures: a father, a little girl, and a woman painted a pale blue like the morning sky. Wren walked up to Bryony. Then he handed her the box with both hands. "I made this for you." Bryony accepted the gift. In her years running the company, she had signed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. But no gift had moved her as much as this small wooden box. Auden brought 2 cups of tea to the porch. He sat down beside her. Not too close, not too far, like 2 people who had overcome misunderstandings and hurt and finally found respect for each other. Ahead of them, Wren was running among the wildflowers by the fence. The gentle autumn sunlight bathed the small courtyard. No one tried to change their life that day, but their lives changed. Because sometimes, the most valuable thing isn't building a successful company, but maintaining integrity when no one is watching. And that's what brought Auden Mercer back to where he belonged. If this story makes you believe that kindness, humility, and integrity will ultimately be rewarded, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories. And let us know in the comments. If you were Bryony, How would you feel discovering that the person you once looked down on was actually your co-founder? Your answer might appear in the next video, and there are many more heartwarming stories waiting for you to discover below.